The skies over Ardna Ridge churned with clouds, a bruised gray as if the heavens themselves mourned the inevitable violence. The settlement below clung stubbornly to the ridge's rocky edge, its prefabricated buildings scoured by decades of abrasive winds. To the galactic Dominion, it was nothing more than a speck of dirt, another conquest in their endless march across the stars. But to the few who called it home, it was everything. In orbit, the Dominion fleet hung like a crown of dark metal, its warships gleaming with cold precision. From their vantage, the colony's defenses were laughable, primitive, kinetic weapons, sandbagged barricades, and outdated surveillance drones. In the grand calculus of war, Ardna Ridge wasn't even a decimal point. It was a warm-up. On the bridge of the Dominion flagship, Irides Vale, General Thasian surveyed the holographic map of the valley below. His clawed hand traced the glowing grid lines with the casual air of an artist evaluating his canvas. The hologram rendered the settlement in exquisite detail, its crude defenses, narrow streets, and exposed flanks. It was a butcher's diagram, ready for dissection. "Deploy a single battalion," Thasian said, his tone more bored than commanding. "This colony isn't worth anything more." A subordinate, a wiry alien with bulbous eyes, hesitated. "General, there are reports of unusual sensor interference near the ridge. It could be the wind," Thasian interrupted, his mandibles clicking in irritation. "Or these humans and their relics of war. Let them play soldier for an hour. It won't change the outcome." The officers around him chuckled, their laughter rich with condescension. To them, humanity was a species stuck in the mud, still clutching at antiquated tools while the galaxy surged ahead. They were here to enforce superiority, not contend with a challenge. Down on the planet, Captain Elias Torin lay prone on the ridge, the battered metal of his rifle pressing into his shoulder. The wind carried the scent of scorched earth and machine oil, mingling with the acrid bite of ozone from his camouflage generator. He adjusted the scope, the ridgeline a kaleidoscope of jagged shadows and faint glimmers of light from the colony below. Elias didn't look like a hero. His face was lined from years of battle, his beard patchy and streaked with silver. His armor bore the marks of countless skirmishes, its surface scuffed and pitted, but still serviceable. He didn't need shiny plating or ceremonial rank pins. What he had was far more lethal: patience. Beside him, the comlink crackled. "Captain Torin, report," Major Dana Okoye's voice said, calm but laced with urgency. The hum of activity from the underground command center buzzed faintly in the background. "Dominion landing craft are breaking atmosphere. Single battalion," Elias said, his voice a gravelly whisper that matched the stone beneath him. "Understood. Reinforcements are still hours out. You know what that means." Elias smiled grimly. "I hold the line." "Do more than hold it," Okoye replied. "Make them regret coming here." He shut off the comm and exhaled slowly, his breath a misty wisp in the cool air. His eyes scanned the valley below, a predator's gaze picking apart its prey. The Dominion forces were already descending, their landing craft kicking up plumes of dust that rose like accusing specters into the fading light. Their formation was textbook, arrogantly so. Elias's mind flicked through probabilities like a deck of cards. They wouldn't expect resistance this far from the main front. That was their first mistake. From his vantage point, the valley stretched like an open wound. The settlers' barricades looked feeble against the encroaching tide of Dominion soldiers, their shimmering armor reflecting the last rays of daylight. Elias clenched his jaw. The air seemed to hum with anticipation, a taut silence before the string snapped. His fingers brushed over the rifle's stock, worn smooth from years of use. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a legacy. His grandfather had built it, each component crafted with care, its mechanism oiled with stories of survival. It was a symbol of everything the Dominion didn't understand: craftsmanship, persistence, and the stubborn refusal to yield. Through the scope, he spotted his first target, a Dominion officer barking orders as his troops disembarked. Elias noted the details, the way the officer's posture screamed confidence, the arrogance in his striding gait. The alien's voice carried faintly through the valley, distorted but unmistakably dismissive. "They're ants beneath our boots," the officer said. His mandibles twitched in what Elias assumed was amusement. The troops laughed as they fanned out, their movements unhurried. Elias tightened his grip on the rifle. "Laugh it up," he muttered. "Let's see how funny you are when this starts." The Dominion soldiers moved with mechanical precision, their armor shimmering with embedded energy fields. To them, the colony was already theirs. A few stragglers paused to mock the settlers' crude defenses, a barbed wire fence, sandbags hastily thrown together. "Is this their idea of a fortification?" One soldier jeered, kicking at a rusted barricade. Another picked up a discarded rifle, turning it over like a relic from some primitive museum. Through his earpiece, Elias could hear their arrogance, the smug satisfaction in their voices. His stomach churned, not with fear, but with the quiet fury of a hunter watching prey, oblivious to its danger. He steadied his breathing, the cold air burning slightly as it filled his lungs. The scope's crosshairs settled over the officer's head. Time seemed to stretch, every detail sharpening, the faint whir of servos in the alien's armor, the metallic tang of the rifle's barrel, the pulse of his own heartbeat. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, the crack of the shot ripping through the valley. The officer's head snapped back, his body crumpling like a marionette with its strings cut. For a moment the valley was silent, the laughter of the Dominion troops frozen mid-breath. Then came the shouting. Elias smirked as the aliens scrambled for cover, their previous confidence shattered. Through the scope, he could see their faces, wide-eyed, panicked, their earlier bravado replaced with the stark realization that they were being hunted. "Captain Torrin," Okoye's voice came through the comm again, sharper this time. "What's happening up there?" "Just introducing myself," he replied, his tone dry. Okoye's laugh was soft, but approving. "Well, make it memorable." Elias shifted his position, crawling silently to a new vantage point. His ghillie suit blended seamlessly with the rocky terrain, the fabric infused with heat-dispersing tech to avoid detection. He moved like a ghost, invisible to the naked eye and to the Dominion's sophisticated scanners. The aliens began firing blindly into the ridge, their energy weapons scorching the rocks and filling the air with the acrid smell of burning mineral. Elias ignored it, his focus unbroken. He chambered another round, already scanning for his next target. The hunt had begun, and Elias Torrin was just getting started. The chaos that erupted in the valley below was almost musical to Captain Elias Torrin. Shouts echoed, overlapping with the piercing hum of energy weapons firing blindly into the ridgeline. He slid into a new position, the weight of his rifle familiar against his chest, his movements as fluid as shadows bending in the dusk. The scent of scorched stone clung to the air, mingling with the faint metallic tang of his sweat. The Dominion soldiers were in disarray, their once tight formation now a scattering of confused figures scrambling for cover. "Sniper! Up on the ridge!" one of them barked, his voice tinged with panic. Elias suppressed a smirk, watching through his scope as they shifted uneasily. Their shimmering armor, once a display of dominance, now glinted like fragile glass in the fading light. The soldiers were moving erratically, their discipline unraveling as their training failed to account for an invisible, unrelenting adversary. He adjusted the scope, his breath measured, his focus a blade honed to a razor's edge. He sighted another target, a comms officer hunched behind a boulder, his glowing interface flickering as he tried to re-establish order. Elias tracked the slight tremor in the alien's hands, the way his head darted up every few seconds, scanning for a predator he couldn't see. The trigger felt cold beneath Elias's finger, steady as he exhaled and fired. The round struck cleanly, punching through the comms officer's visor and snapping his head back. The Dominion's radio chatter fractured into chaos, the remaining soldiers shouting over one another as their chain of command continued to splinter. From the valley floor, the Dominion's General Thasian watched the unraveling disaster through a holographic display in his command unit. His mandibles twitched in frustration as he slammed a clawed hand onto the table, the impact sending a faint tremor through the glowing interface. "Enough of this cowardice," he snarled. "Fan out and flush him out of that ridge." One of his lieutenants, a wiry alien with dark, bulging eyes, hesitated. "General, their sniper is using kinetic projectiles. Our energy shields are—" "Adapt, or I'll find someone who can," Thasian snapped. His words carried venom, but the doubt was visible in the curl of his clawed hand. This wasn't how the battle was supposed to unfold. Humans were supposed to be inconsequential, a nuisance, not a threat. Above the chaos, Elias moved through the ridgeline with calculated precision. Each footstep was deliberate, the crunch of gravel muffled beneath the soles of his boots. The air around him felt electric, charged with the tension of predator and prey. His eyes scanned the terrain, noting every jagged rock and narrow crevice, his mind a map of escape routes and kill zones. Through the comms, Major Okoye's voice crackled in his ear. "You've stirred the hornet's nest, Captain. They're sending in reinforcements." "I was wondering when they'd get serious," Elias replied, his voice low but calm. He allowed himself a moment to wipe the sweat from his brow, the rough fabric of his glove brushing against his skin. "You've got thermal drones incoming," Okoye continued. "They're sweeping for heat signatures." Elias glanced upward, spotting faint glimmers in the sky as the drones descended. Their spherical forms whirred with a mechanical hum, and a faint red glow marked their sensors. He adjusted his gear, activating the heat-dispersing panels in his suit. The fabric cooled against his skin, masking his body's warmth and rendering him a ghost against their infrared scans. The drones hovered low, sweeping the ridge in deliberate, methodical arcs. Elias remained perfectly still, his breath shallow as one passed mere meters above his position. The faint, ozone-like scent of its propulsion systems tickled his nose, mingling with the earthy tang of dust stirred by its wake. His finger twitched near the trigger, but he held his fire. Patience was a sniper's greatest weapon. As the drones moved on, Elias shifted his attention back to the valley. The Dominion soldiers were regrouping, their movements frantic but slowly coalescing under new orders. Their desperation was palpable, like a cornered animal baring its teeth. Elias chambered another round, the metallic click a small but satisfying sound in the cacophony of war. His next target was a squad leader, identifiable by the glowing insignia on his chest plate. The alien was shouting orders, gesturing toward the ridge, his voice sharp and commanding. Elias noted the subtle stiffness in his movements, the slight hesitation in his steps. Fear had seeped into their ranks, and it was spreading like rot. The wind shifted, carrying the sharp, acrid scent of burning vegetation from the valley below. Elias adjusted his aim, factoring in the change, and fired. The shot rang out, a sharp crack that echoed through the ridge like a thunderclap. The squad leader fell, his body crumpling into the dirt as his troops scattered once more. "Captain Torin," Okoye's voice cut in again. "They're switching tactics. Expect artillery strikes next." Elias scanned the valley, spotting the telltale shimmer of energy cannons being set up near the Dominion's landing craft. Their crews moved with frantic efficiency, hauling massive components into place. He let out a low breath, his fingers tightening around the rifle's grip. "Let them try," he muttered. "They'll just waste ammunition." The artillery opened fire, the first blast hitting the ridgeline with a deafening roar. Rocks exploded in fiery shards, sending plumes of dust and debris into the air. The shockwave rattled Elias's bones, the heat of the explosion prickling his skin even through the reinforced suit. He gritted his teeth and rolled into a shallow depression, his body pressed tightly against the ground as more rounds struck the ridge. The landscape transformed into a storm of fire and stone, each blast a hammer blow against the earth. Elias's world shrank to the raw sensations of survival, the concussive force of detonations, the taste of grit on his tongue, the acrid smoke stinging his eyes. But he held fast, his mind racing as he recalculated his next move. As the barrage subsided, Elias emerged from the debris, his suit caked in dust, but his resolve unshaken. He crawled to a new position, using the lingering smoke as cover. His movements were swift, precise, like a predator weaving through underbrush. Through his scope, he spotted a group of Dominion troops advancing cautiously up the ridge. Their energy weapons scanned the shadows, their movements slower now, more deliberate. Elias smiled grimly. They were learning, but not fast enough. He let them get closer, their forms growing larger in his scope, the faint glow of their armor casting eerie halos against the darkening sky. When they were within range, he fired again. The lead soldier dropped, his comrades diving for cover. Elias shifted his position, already lining up his next shot. The valley was his now, a chessboard where every move belonged to him. And as the Dominion forces faltered once more, their laughter and arrogance now replaced by fear, Elias knew the game had only just begun. The air was alive with tension, crackling with the remnants of the artillery barrage. Dust hung heavy, mingling with the sharp tang of ozone and the faint metallic scent of scorched armor. Captain Elias Torren lay motionless in the shallow crater he had claimed as his sanctuary. His muscles were taut, his mind sharp, his body a coiled spring waiting for the right moment to strike. Through the thinning veil of smoke, the Dominion troops were reorganizing. Their ranks, fractured and chaotic moments before, were beginning to tighten under the barked orders of new commanders. Elias watched, his keen eyes tracking the shift in their movements. The alien soldiers moved with an urgency now, their earlier bravado replaced by grim determination. They had realized their mistake. This was no simple hunt, and Elias was no prey. His calm crackled faintly. Major Okoye's voice came through calm, but edged with unease. They've adapted faster than I expected. Their scanners are recalibrating for your decoys. You need to switch tactics. Elias smirked faintly, his dry lips cracking in the arid air. Let them try. They're still thinking in straight lines. Straight lines might be enough if they level the ridge, Okoye replied. We're picking up energy cannon signatures. They're deploying heavier artillery. Elias sighed, the weight of the rifle grounding him in the shifting chaos. He could feel the grit on his tongue, the faint burn of adrenaline in his veins. His gaze flicked back to the enemy lines. Their artillery crews were moving with mechanical precision, each alien a cog in a war machine that had crushed countless worlds. But machines could be broken. His hand moved instinctively to the small pack beside him, fingers brushing over the rough fabric before withdrawing a compact explosive device. A gift from a demolitions expert back on Earth, a man whose humor was as dry as the explosives were volatile. Elias murmured a silent thanks and began his crawl toward the Dominion's forward artillery position. The terrain was unforgiving, a tangle of jagged rocks and loose soil that threatened to betray his movements with every shift. The smell of charred vegetation clung to the ground, mingling with the faintly acrid odor of the camouflage spray coating his suit. He moved with the precision of a predator, each inch calculated, each pause deliberate. His breathing slowed, his senses narrowing to the vibrations of the ground beneath him and the faint murmurs of the enemy ahead. The Dominion troops had formed a defensive perimeter around the artillery, their energy shields humming faintly in the stillness. Elias watched from his concealed position, studying their patterns, their weaknesses. The soldiers stood like sentinels, their visors scanning the ridge, but their posture betrayed their unease. They were braced for an assault they couldn't see coming, their confidence now a brittle shell. Elias set the charge with practiced efficiency, his hands steady even as the muffled chatter of alien voices grew louder. The device nestled beneath a cluster of boulders, its timer set to coincide with the next wave of Dominion fire. He retreated as quietly as he had come, the weight of his mission pressing heavier with each step. He reached his vantage point just as the first energy cannon roared to life, its blinding arc searing the night. The impact lit up the ridge like a thunderstorm, the air rippling with heat and the ground trembling beneath the assault. Elias waited, counting the seconds in his head as the Dominion soldiers cheered their supposed victory. The explosion tore through their ranks, a fiery bloom that consumed the artillery and the soldiers guarding it. The air filled with the deafening roar of the blast, the acrid tang of burning metal, and the panicked screams of the survivors. Elias watched through his scope as the Dominion formation dissolved into chaos once more, their lines breaking like glass under a hammer. "Nice work," Okoye's voice cut through the static, her tone laced with approval. That should slow them down. Not for long, Elias replied. They'll regroup. They always do. He shifted his position again, his movements fluid and deliberate. The ridge was a labyrinth he had memorized, every crevice and outcrop a potential stronghold. He slipped into another shadowed hollow just as the first drones began their sweep. Their mechanical whir was faint but insistent, their red sensors slicing through the darkness like predatory eyes. Elias pressed himself flat against the ground, the coolness of the rocks seeping through his armor. The drone passed overhead, its light brushing the edges of his concealment. He didn't move, didn't breathe, his pulse steady as a metronome. The faint scent of engine oil wafted down with the drone's exhaust, mingling with the earthy aroma of the ridge. Through the smoke and fire below, a new figure emerged. Elias adjusted his scope, focusing on a towering Dominion commander clad in ornate armor that shimmered like obsidian. His strides were purposeful, his gestures commanding as he rallied the faltering troops. This was no ordinary officer. This was someone with authority, someone who could turn the tide of the battle. Elias's finger hovered over the trigger, his instincts urging him to take the shot, but something held him back. The commander's movements were deliberate, almost theatrical, as though he knew he was being watched. It was a trap. "Okoye," Elias murmured into the comm. "They've got a new leader on the field. He's baiting me." "Can you confirm?" Okoye asked, her voice sharp with concern. "His positioning's too perfect. They're trying to draw me out." "Then don't take the bait," she replied. "Stay in the shadows. We can't afford to lose you." Elias stayed his hand, the weight of the rifle cold against his skin. The Dominion troops were forming up again, their movements more coordinated now under the commander's direction. The sense of urgency in their ranks was palpable, like a storm gathering strength. The air seemed to thrum with it, a low vibration that settled in Elias's chest. He scanned the battlefield, noting the subtle changes in their strategy. They were tightening their perimeter, deploying overlapping shields to create a mobile fortress. Their movements were slower, more methodical, as if they were learning from his attacks. They weren't just reacting anymore, they were adapting. The realization sent a chill down his spine. For the first time since the battle began, Elias felt the faint stirrings of doubt. The Dominion was evolving and the game was shifting. From his position, Elias could see the remnants of the colony below, its buildings battered but still standing. The settlers' barricades were little more than twisted wreckage now, their defenders scattered and exhausted. The faint glow of emergency lights cast long shadows over the desolation, the smell of burnt metal and scorched earth thick in the air. Elias gritted his teeth, his resolve hardening. The Dominion thought they were closing in, tightening their grip on the ridge. But they had underestimated one thing. He had planned for this. Every move they made had already been anticipated, every countermeasure accounted for. He adjusted his scope again, his breath steady as he lined up his next shot. The Dominion's new formation was a fortress, but every fortress had its weak point. And Elias Torin was a man who knew how to find it. Elias Torin remained motionless, his body pressed against the cold, jagged earth of the ridgeline. The Dominion troops had tightened their formation below, the shimmering lattice of overlapping energy shields casting a faint iridescent glow across the battlefield. Through his scope, Elias studied their movements. They were learning, adapting. Their once fractured lines now moved with precision, like a machine realigning its cogs. But even machines had breaking points. The faint hum of their energy barriers thrummed in his ears, blending with the distant crackle of lingering fires. The acrid stench of scorched metal and the faint bitterness of ionized air hung heavy, coating the back of his throat. The Dominion commander strode purposefully at the heart of the formation, his blackened armor catching the low light like polished obsidian. He radiated control, his gestures sharp and deliberate as he directed his troops into defensive clusters. Elias adjusted his position, the rough texture of his gloves brushing against the rifle stock. The enemy's shields were a problem, but not an unsolvable one. His mind raced, calculating angles, timing, and weak points. He didn't have the luxury of reinforcements yet. Every decision had to count. "Okoye," he murmured into the comm, his voice barely audible over the crackle of static. They're moving into a siege formation. I'm going to need an edge. I'm working on it, Okoye replied, her tone clipped but steady. The faint hum of machinery echoed on her end as she relayed orders to the resistance forces below. Dr. Vance might have something for you. Stand by. Elias frowned, his focus shifting back to the battlefield. He couldn't afford to wait too long. The Dominion's formation was compact, but it made them vulnerable to specific types of attacks. If only he could exploit it. His fingers tapped against the rifle as he recalled the layout of the terrain. The valley wasn't just a battlefield. It was a weapon. Through his scope, he spotted a ridge to the east, a jagged outcrop that overlooked the Dominion's main position. It wasn't ideal for direct sniper fire, but it could serve another purpose. He needed to force their hand to make them overcommit in a way they couldn't recover from. "Major," Elias said, his voice more certain now, "I need a controlled detonation on the east ridge. If we can create enough of a landslide, it'll force their shields to redirect and expose a flank." "You're asking me to set off an avalanche?" Okoye replied, her tone incredulous. "Not an avalanche," Elias corrected, his lips curving into a faint smile. "A precision collapse. We don't need to bury them. Just push them where we want them." There was a pause on the other end, followed by the faint sound of typing. "Dr. Vance is rigging something now. But Elias, this is going to take timing. If you're off by even a second—" "I won't be," he interrupted. "Just get it done." He shifted again, his body low to the ground as he crawled to a new position. The rocky terrain bit into his elbows and knees, the rough texture scraping against his armor. The faint scent of dust and earth filled his nostrils as he found a narrow crevice that offered a better vantage point. Minutes ticked by, each one dragging like an eternity. The Dominion troops below were fortifying their position further, deploying portable turrets and adjusting their shield configurations. Elias could hear the faint whine of their generators, the sound cutting through the stillness like a predator's growl. Finally, Okoye's voice returned. "We're ready. Vance says you've got one shot to make this work. Detonation will disrupt their shields, but only for a few seconds. You'll need to be fast." Elias exhaled slowly, his breath misting in the cool air. His hand steadied on the rifle, his finger brushing against the trigger. "On my mark," he said, his voice a low growl. He adjusted the scope, his eyes locking onto the eastern ridge. 3, 2, 1, mark. The explosion tore through the night, a deep guttural roar that echoed across the valley. The ground shook beneath Elias, the vibrations coursing through his body as rocks and debris cascaded down the eastern slope. The Dominion troops reacted instantly, their shields shifting to absorb the brunt of the falling rubble. But it was exactly what Elias had anticipated. The moment their shields shifted, a gap flickered open along their western flank. It was small, no more than a few meters wide, but it was enough. Elias didn't hesitate. He lined up his shot, his breath steady, his focus absolute. The Dominion commander came into view, his figure framed in the chaos. For a brief moment, their eyes seemed to meet through the scope, a fleeting connection across the battlefield. Elias pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, a sharp, piercing crack that cut through the cacophony. The Dominion commander staggered, a dark spatter blooming across his chest as he crumpled to the ground. The formation faltered immediately, the soldiers hesitating as confusion rippled through their ranks. Elias didn't stop. He chambered another round, his movements fluid, almost instinctive. His next target was a communications officer scrambling to re-establish order. Another pull of the trigger, and the officer dropped. Below, the Dominion forces were unraveling. The landslide had scattered their ranks, forcing them into smaller, less organized groups. Without their commander, their movements were disjointed, their cohesion broken. "Okoye," Elias said, his voice sharp, "now's your chance. Push the militia forward while they're scattered." "Already on it," she replied. Her voice carried a hint of satisfaction. "And Elias, nice shot." He allowed himself a brief smile before refocusing. The battle was far from over. The Dominion troops were rallying again, their desperation driving them to regroup despite the chaos. Elias adjusted his position, his body blending seamlessly with the rocky terrain as he prepared for the next wave. The wind shifted, carrying the faint metallic tang of blood and the acrid bitterness of smoke. The valley was a maelstrom of fire and shadow, the once clear night now shrouded in destruction. But in the heart of the storm, Elias felt a strange calm. Every movement, every decision, was part of a larger plan, a symphony of strategy and instinct that he had been orchestrating since the battle began. As the first rays of dawn began to break over the horizon, casting the battlefield in a pale, golden light, Elias knew the tide was turning. The Dominion had come to Ardena Ridge expecting an easy victory. What they found instead was resistance forged in fire, a sniper who had turned their arrogance into their undoing. But deep down, Elias also knew this was just the beginning. The real battle was yet to come. The golden light of dawn spilled over the battlefield, illuminating the carnage like an artist unveiling a masterpiece of ruin. Smoke coiled lazily into the air, its acrid tendrils carrying the bitter tang of burned metal and shattered pride. Captain Elias Torrin lay on his stomach at the ridgeline, his rifle cradled like an extension of his own body. His world had shrunk to the narrow scope of his weapon, the swirling chaos of the valley below fading into the background. Every shot, every breath, every heartbeat was measured. The Dominion soldiers were reforming, their desperation knitting their fractured lines into something resembling unity. The death of their commander had not broken them entirely. It had only slowed the inevitable. Now another officer, more cautious and less arrogant, had taken charge, rallying the remnants of the once pristine battalion. Elias shifted slightly, the rough edges of the rock biting into his elbows. The smell of dirt and sweat clung to him, mingling with the faint chemical scent of his camouflage spray. His eyes scanned the battlefield, calculating. Every inch of the valley was a chessboard, and he knew the game better than anyone. The comlink crackled to life. "Captain Torrin, this is Okoye." Major Okoye's voice was taut, the strain of battle threading through her words. "Militia forces are moving into position. They'll flank the enemy's eastern side in 5 minutes. Can you hold them off that long?" Elias smirked faintly. 5 minutes? That's an eternity. "Don't get cocky," Okoye warned. "They're sending their heavy units. This isn't over." "It never is," Elias muttered, cutting the connection. His hands moved deftly, loading another round into the rifle. The smooth metallic click felt like a drumbeat, a prelude to the final act. Below, the Dominion's heavy assault units began their advance. Hulking walkers, bristling with weaponry, lumbered forward, their steps shaking the earth. Their armored hulls gleamed in the early light, their energy shields shimmering like molten glass. Infantry units moved alongside them, their formation tighter now, their fear tempered by the false security of overwhelming firepower. Elias watched, his expression impassive. Fear wasn't in his vocabulary, not anymore. He had faced worse odds before, survived against forces that should have crushed him. The Dominion thought they were invincible, that their technology would shield them from the raw, unrelenting force of human ingenuity. That was their first mistake. Their last mistake would come soon enough. He adjusted his scope, tracking the lead walker. Its massive frame loomed like a titan, each step a seismic punctuation mark, but even titans could fall. Elias exhaled slowly, his finger brushing the trigger. The walker's weak point, its exposed energy core, glowed faintly at the base of its rear leg. It was a small target, but for Elias, small targets were just challenges waiting to be conquered. The shot rang out, a sharp crack that split the morning air. The walker staggered, its leg crumpling as the energy core ruptured in a blinding flash. The explosion sent a shockwave through the valley, shrapnel slicing through nearby infantry. The Dominion formation faltered again, their advance stalling as panic rippled through their ranks. Elias chambered another round, his focus unbroken. He could feel the rhythm of the battlefield shifting, the momentum tipping in his favor. Each shot was a hammer blow, shattering the illusion of Dominion superiority. The soldiers below scrambled for cover, their movements frantic as they tried to regroup. "Okoye," Elias said into the calm, his voice calm despite the chaos. "They're breaking. Push your forces now." "Understood," she replied, Her tone carried a grim satisfaction. "Militia is moving in. Keep their eyes on you." "With pleasure," Elias said, a flicker of dark humor in his voice. The Dominion troops were firing wildly now, their energy weapons scorching the rocks and soil in blind retaliation. The air crackled with the hum of discharged plasma, the heat pressing against Elias's skin like a suffocating blanket. He shifted again, moving to a new position with the fluidity of a shadow. Every movement was deliberate, every step calculated to avoid detection. He lined up his next shot, targeting a squad leader shouting orders into a comm device. The bullet found its mark, and the squad dissolved into confusion, their cohesion shattered. Elias allowed himself a grim smile. Every action had a purpose, every shot a message. Humanity would not be underestimated. The militia forces emerged from the eastern ridgeline, their makeshift weapons and battered armor a stark contrast to the Dominion's polished machines. But their determination was unshakable. They moved with precision, their flanking attack catching the Dominion off guard. The battle shifted again, the once dominant forces of the Dominion now caught between two fronts. Elias didn't stop. His rifle whispered death across the battlefield, each round a punctuation mark in the story he was writing, a story of defiance, of survival, of humanity refusing to bow. He targeted officers first, then medics, then heavy gunners. Every shot dismantled the Dominion's ability to fight, piece by piece. The Dominion's final stand came swiftly. Their forces, reduced to a fraction of their original strength, formed a desperate defensive perimeter. Their once gleaming armor was tarnished, their weapons firing sporadically as their energy reserves dwindled. They huddled together, their earlier arrogance replaced by a grim, animalistic desperation. Elias watched from the ridge, his rifle resting against his shoulder. His body ached, his muscles heavy with exhaustion, but he didn't move. He had seen this before. The breaking point, the moment when an enemy realized they were beaten but refused to surrender. It was a quiet kind of satisfaction, knowing he had turned their hubris into their undoing. The comm crackled again. "Captain Torin, reinforcements have arrived," Okoye said. Her voice carried a note of relief. "Drop ships are inbound. The valley is secure." Elias exhaled deeply, his breath misting in the cool morning air. "About time," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. As the drop ships descended, their engines roaring like thunder, the Dominion troops threw down their weapons. What was left of their once mighty battalion surrendered, their heads bowed in defeat. The militia forces cheered, their voices rising like a tidal wave across the battlefield. Elias stood slowly, his body protesting every movement. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and began the long climb down the ridge. Each step was heavy, his boots crunching against the loose gravel. The smell of smoke and blood was overwhelming, a visceral reminder of the cost of victory. When he reached the valley floor, the militia greeted him with awe and gratitude. But Elias didn't stop to celebrate. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the faint glow of the Dominion's retreating ships was visible. This was a victory, but it was far from the end. Okoye approached, her expression one of quiet respect. "You did it, Elias. You held the line." "For now," he replied, his voice low. He looked back at the ridge, at the bodies and debris that marked the battlefield. "They'll be back. They always are. But they'll think twice next time," Okoye said, her tone resolute. "Because of you." Elias nodded, his gaze distant. He knew she was right. The Dominion had come to Ardena Ridge expecting an easy conquest. What they found instead was a single sniper who had turned their arrogance into ashes. This wasn't just a battle, it was a warning. As the first rays of sunlight pierced the smoke-filled sky, Elias stood amidst the wreckage, a silent guardian of humanity's resolve. The galaxy would remember this day, not for the Dominion's might, but for the moment they learned that humanity, no matter how underestimated, could never be broken.